All right, perfect, cool. All right, so we are live. So it's a new year. It's an even year, which for whatever reason I love. I was talking to my wife last night about that. I was like, I really don't like odd numbered years. I don't know what there is about that, but uh, 2024 is just it's kind of nice for some reason. It just sounds good, you know?
Yeah, it's got a good ring to it. It's like when you're changing the volume on your TV and it ends on an odd number. You're like, I need to turn it up one more notch, make sure it ends on an even one. Yeah.
I am not ashamed to say I'm that person who will always adjust the volume to an even number.
Oh yeah. Or if it ends in 0 or 5, sometimes just
Yeah,
right on that one.
exactly. Exactly. So we got people jumping in. So as you guys are jumping in, again, this is a very open-ended kind of conversation. These are our weekly office hours. So if you have questions, you have feature requests, ideas, things you want to geek out and talk about, would love to have those. So go ahead and throw those into the comment section for us to see. So as these are coming through, we can sort of dive deep into each one of those. It's funny. There's a lot of chatter right now about 2024 just being a massive game changer year for
Mhm.
tech, just as a whole.
Yeah.
And for me, I like to look at what's coming down the line the next 6 to 18 months, because once it becomes, you know, technically available, eventually it becomes mainstream, it becomes more accessible, and it starts to trickle down to um, every industry, right? And
Mhm.
what's interesting is that trickle down effect is happening faster than it used to. It used to be like, all right, that's cutting edge. Give it 2 years, maybe three, for it to go, to the end user. And now it's like 3 months. Things are just moving
Yeah.
so fast. A lot of big tech companies, especially companies like that we use internally, like Intercom for support,
Mhm.
um, they're just moving super fast, which is incredible. So I'm very excited. I feel like we're finally on the cusp of AI personal assistants. I've been geeking about this whole concept of not needing a virtual assistant, and
Mhm.
eventually you'll kind of switch over to a digital assistant, which I know virtual digital, what the heck's the difference? Welcome to language in our world, which is why we just published a blog post on Tuesday about what instant repricing actually means, because there's a lot of terminology that gets thrown around. But yeah, there's this whole concept that in engineering, the 10x engineer, right? Like that singular engineer who's just so talented, so well versed that the value is just 10x. Like they're incredible.
Mhm.
I don't see why we can't transition in 2024 to 10x fill in the blank, whatever you do,
Yeah.
right? 10x knowledge worker, 10x Amazon seller.
Yeah.
I think that's coming. It's pretty exciting to kind of see this be on the cusp, though.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I think the big thing is just that the tools that are available when they're used properly and you can automate as much of your process as possible, that frees you up to whether it's, read up on best practices, fine tune something that you've been working on. So it's able to kind of function in parallel. Like you have
Yeah.
your typical day-to-day tasks are now automated and now you can kind of really focus on growth, learning,
Mhm.
whatever that next phase is going to be. Um, and yeah, it's really been interesting being in tech the last few years, and when new kind of groundbreaking updates come through, the ability at which people are able to kind of deploy them into their everyday or just their where they would typically take a few months to implement things. It seems it's down to a couple weeks or even days of like, hey, really quick to understand it. Now let's start using it and leveraging it right away.
Mhm.
So it's interesting that there's still a learning curve, obviously, but it seems to be not quite as steep between the learning portion and the application portion of it as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a different way to think, right?
Mhm.
Like operating in natural language is by itself kind of interesting, but you have this added level of technical leverage that the average person is getting access to, that the average seller is getting access to. Even when ChatGPT first came out, the go-to thing that I was like, oh, it'd be cool if I could do this. Let's go run the experiment. We wrote a blog post on this, basically like, could we teach not even the model itself, but ChatGPT? I fed it a blog post on how to do listing optimization. I was like,
Mhm.
you got it. All right, cool. Here's a listing. Here's all the data. Let's just see what's possible here. And it had some really good stuff. Was it
Mhm.
perfect? Probably not. Did we run like a full A/B test? No, but it did go to show that kind of off the shelf, this technology is just capable of a lot more than you would just rationally assume. And so if you start to think, okay, well, what happens when you take that model and you actually do something what's called like fine tuning, basically like making it specialize in that thing. And you do have an AI tool that specializes in conversion rate optimization and SEO ranking for Amazon listings. What happens then, right? What happens when, and I think this is a huge opportunity, but using GPT-4 for customer support requests, right? If you have a ton of support requests, what do you tend to do? You're probably using templates, right? Saved responses. You still have to send those, right? So like if you're a seller right now, every area you use a template or you outsource to a virtual assistant, you should be looking for tools or creating your own tools that can handle far more complexity than any other alternative, and it can do it faster and at scale. That's what's interesting. If you look at tools like Zapier.com or Make.com, their competitor, it's automation, but it's very rigid, right? It doesn't really handle these exceptions. It's very much like if this, then do that. Whereas AI, especially like your large language models, allow you to apply reasoning, which is like the most mind-blowing thing of all time. So it kind of can handle some of these exceptional rules. This is something we're probably going to experiment with internally too on the support side. Like, kind of definitely just knows all your documentation, it knows your tool, knows your users, and it could just answer things hyper personalized very fast. That sounds wonderful.
Yeah, it's been really interesting. I've been playing within Intercom. They have a way that you can pass a ticket to a teammate and have AI summarize what you've already discussed. Yeah. Now, luckily for me, my teammate Finn is usually sitting right across from me, so I don't need to do this often, but I've been testing it just to see how their AI is able to summarize if it can do it well. And even just in my whatever it's been, month and a half, almost 2 months now, even just the summary of like the ability for it to kind of summarize that effectively has significantly improved. And if that's just in support, application is really limitless outside of that as well.
Yeah. It's funny. It seems like such a simple thing, but having, being able to jump into a massive thread and be like, all right, what's happening? What did happen? What did we try? What didn't we try? That's so difficult, that context switch, and to be able to basically run one keyboard shortcut. It's like, here's everything in a bulleted list. I'm like, oh, cool. It takes me 30 seconds to get up and running. And it's like, I have the full context that I'm not going to say, hey, have we tried this when like it's clearly stated that we did. So just the speed, right? That increases quality of responses and stuff like that too, which is super interesting. So as you guys are jumping in here, I got more people jumping in. Make sure you throw some comments in here. Would love to dive deep into different topics. Again, this is very open-ended kind of session here that we're doing weekly now moving forward, where we can dive deep into specifics on repricing strategies, data. We can dive deeper into just life as a seller. We can just geek out on that kind of stuff, which is pretty fun. Sourcing, all these things. As a seller, you have a never-ending list of problems. Maybe call them opportunities to be a little bit more optimistic. But all the sellers I talk to, it's like thing after thing. It's frustrating sometimes, I'm sure. But it's nice when we can kind of have these open-ended sessions and just kind of dive deep into some of the stuff.
Yeah, especially if there's anything top of mind for folks going into the new year, whether they should prioritize certain things. Would love to even hear just how you folks are thinking about it, and we can kind of spin off of that and put our own thoughts on it. So it doesn't have to be any questions, can be more high level conversational type stuff as well.
Yeah. Here's an interesting one from John. For zero competition listings, i.e. private label or branded bundles, that's actually a big one. Is there a way to wiggle the price with workflows? Amazon likes to see life in the price. I've heard any other ideas for branded bundles with no competition. So this is actually a really cool one. In Legacy Aura, kind of what I would recommend is to basically use a workflow and then just move the price around a little bit. However, with Maven, the conversation kind of shifts because Maven calculates something called an optimal price. That optimal price actually changes depending on the dynamics of the listing, even if there's no competition. So we actually ran this experiment internally, not intentionally, it just kind of happened. We spun up a mini OA account so we could start testing a bunch of stuff internally, even some crazy ideas. And if it blew up, it was fine. And so we had this SKU come on. We were the only seller. And Maven auto calculated the optimal price and it was pretty good. Came out like 95. We got a sale or two, and then it actually calculated it up. I think it was like 118. So it actually went up. So our price raised. We started to get some sales there, but Maven realized the sales velocity was actually a little bit lower, so it started to adjust itself a little bit. But what's interesting is when competition did come back onto that listing, we're now not competing at that original $95, $98. We're above $100 competing, which is really interesting. So we really showed that Maven's able to do some really good optimization for basically private label, although it's not designed for private label, but like branded bundles is actually a great example here, a great use case. So what I would recommend is actually applying Maven to your branded bundles and letting Maven basically find that optimal price and work within it. It's not going to be on like a set triggering system where just like every 30 minutes it's going to do something. But for the most part, depending on what kind of listing it is, meaning if there's a lot of demand, there's a lot of just organic activity, Maven's probably going to be enough to kind of keep that liveliness, if you will, going. But if you find that it's still not enough because maybe it's a slower listing, as an example, I would start to then layer workflows on top of that. So what I would probably do is essentially just raise your price by like a penny once an hour. Like, doesn't have to be anything crazy. And then just let it hold it for 10 minutes, right? So once an hour, every 3 hours, whatever makes sense for you, raise it by a penny, 10, 15 minutes, and then release, go back to, whatever you were doing before. I think that probably makes a lot of sense, but Casey, I'm curious to hear if you have any other ideas.
Yeah, that was going to be my main suggestion as well, kind of just putting it on hold for a brief moment and then kind of reinitiating it, letting it kind of like reassess whatever data it was able to analyze in that period. I haven't had a lot of folks come through with private label or bundled or branded bundles rather. So don't have as much like hands-on direct experience with a lot of sellers like that, but I do know there's a cohort of our customer base that does do private labels. So only a limited exposure, but that's what I was going to say, kind of using a workflow, kind of hold that price for a minute and then let it resume and kind of continue to try and find where it determines that best price point is going to be.
Yeah. Branded bundles is such an interesting one because it's kind of private label, it's kind of not. And so what's interesting is the moment you bridge the gap in a private label, the tools that you need are very different, but it's also can be very expensive at the same time because you tend to work with larger brands, stuff like that, right? But it's not really, doesn't make sense to run, right? So you tend to have essentially your repricing tools kind of get split into two buckets. You have private label and then reseller based. And so they don't really overlap super well in terms of functionality, just because how you define repricing and a competitor are just fundamentally different.
Right.
So a lot of software companies are going to pick one vertical and kind of dive deep into that. So that leaves this interesting gap where you kind of need some of the functionality of private label repricing, but not really. You're not really going ASIN to ASIN necessarily because it's not brand to brand kind of competition. But you still need that liveliness, like John was saying, some organic activity, which is so interesting. I remember when we first launched, it was probably the first within the first 12 months of us launching Aura 8 years ago, 8 years ago at this point. And we had a user come in and was like, hey, I'm a reseller, but also have my own brand in the same account. Anything we can do? I was like, I have no idea. So at the time, Legacy Aura actually used something called the 3-hour trigger. This just is basically ensured that we didn't, the data didn't become stale because Legacy Aura required an organic price change to reflect changes for you. New Aura 1.0 no longer does that. We have a better system called the replay system that's way more real time. So what we did is we actually took advantage of that 3-hour trigger, which would essentially do what we're recommending here, which is raise your price by a penny and then put it back down. And it would do that every 3 hours if there was no organic activity happening on the listing itself. And so we threw it on there and sales went up 5-10%. I can't guarantee that the trigger system was the thing that caused that, obviously. User was happy. We're like, cool, I guess that kind of works, but it did kind of show even back then that having activity on a listing, not just sales, of course, but activity, changes, updates, all these things is a really positive thing. That kind of makes me question, is there something we could build that allows Aura to go in and just, add a little bit of activity that's pretty nice. I've always had this idea of what if we build a tool that whenever a new listing came in, this kind of goes back to our previous conversation here about like listing optimization using AI and stuff like that.
Sure.
Listing comes into our system, we go, great. Could we make it better? And if we do, we do that. We submit the changes, and not only are we repricing, we're also just making the search better for that listing, right? Keyword optimization, all these different things, right? Because this is something that's interesting, right? When you get into conversion rate optimization and get into sales, you really have to break things out. There is a lot of complexities here. Sometimes you can double the conversion rate on that particular listing, and that just changed everything. And so I think this kind of brings up a concept of adding more complexity and factoring in more things when it comes to repricing, possibly. Who knows, right? But there's a lot there too that I think is very, very interesting. So we have another question here. All right, so here's a good question here, Vadim. I'm fascinated by how AI has revolutionized repricing. It's an incredible concept and execution. Thank you. However, one persistent issue is Amazon Small and Light pricing for products under $10. I've observed that Maven, the AI, sometimes prices my items at $10 instead of $9.99. It seems that the Small and Light pricing doesn't apply specifically to $10, but to any price below $10, which Maven might not recognize. Are you familiar with this? We are. So basically there was a gap. So we were super excited. We supported Small and Light just in time for Amazon to remove the program entirely. So we actually had to transition over to supporting the updated program, which is called the low FBA price fees, which is essentially what you said here. So anything less than $10 is a different fee structure. So now not only Maven, this actually at a very deeper level, every listing Aura is aware of this now. So that went live about a week ago. So there's a change log for this of us releasing that. So what's actually super cool about this release is we don't just factor that in when we're repricing. We look at things like if we're automatically calculating your mins and maxes, Aura is going to understand, okay, that's actually going to put you into a bad position. We should adjust here. So it's going to do that for repricing, whether that's rule-based, whether that's Maven, both factor that in, as well as your automatic mins and maxes, which is super important. So we will actually highlight this. So if you go to any of your listings that are less than $10 in price, you can actually hover over the fees and we'll let you know, hey, this is using the low price FBA fees. That way we call that out so you know, cool, that's exactly what it's using. It's not forgetting anything. Yeah, that transition, it's funny. Amazon things change so fast, and sometimes they give you a lot of notice, like the big deprecation going from the old API, which was known as the MWS API, to the new SP API. They were fantastic, gave us plenty of time, told us exactly what's being deprecated, exactly how to do it. Excuse me, but then you have little things that just sneak up on you. And you're like, cool, you got 2 weeks. Excuse me. And 2 weeks feels like a lot. It's really not when you're running a whole company. It's funny, it's before I got into software, it's like, oh, you just do it, right? You just swap the code. Not really. There's a whole lot more that goes into it as you learn, for sure. But yeah, so that's all sorted, which is awesome. So actually the release recently, the most recent release actually solved that problem for you. So you're all set there, which is nice. And on the AI repricing side, there's still so much open frontiers, what I'm going to call it. Just in terms of what you can do, right? There's a lot of unanswered questions in terms of how far can you take it. I've always said, I think that rule-based gets you probably somewhere between 60 to 80% optimization on average. Now, that's probably for 80% of your listings, right? Like that still leaves out a lot. But I think that's really optimistic in hindsight. Now, just looking at the amount of complexities, even just version 1 of Maven can handle. I think realistically, we're somewhere between 40 and 60% of what's possible right now. And I think as we dive deeper and deeper into the problem, we find more and more frontiers to experiment with. And that's the kind of fun part, because some things are just like obviously going to do well, and they do. And then there's stuff that you're like, well, it should do well, but I have no idea. Let's go find out, right? This is why we like, there's this concept called dog fooding in software, meaning you use your own software. So we launched a mini OA sourcing effort, just to have enough products in there to actually test with real products, right? We're not paper trading here, if you will. And it allows us to really have some of these crazy ideas and go and alpha test it on our own products and just say, hey, we don't make money from this OA account. Let's just see what the performance does. What does the data tell us here? What's really true? And then if it goes really well, great. Let's go to beta. Let's go test with other people at scale, and then eventually goes to production. And that gets really, really fun. So, see John here, same thing with that $10 pricing. And by the way, if we had that release recently, if you're still seeing that, please reach out to the support with the actual SKU. If you're still seeing that it's pricing there, if there is a bug, we definitely want to be aware of that. So definitely, if and this is just like a broad announcement, but like if ever anything feels odd, even if you can't quite put your finger on it, you're just like, something feels odd here, reach out, because we see so much. When Casey was onboarding at the company, I was like, hey, listen, eventually you're going to see so much of the potentials that you're going to realize there's really only 10 possibilities here. Mm-hmm. And you just hear the language and you're like, it's probably one of these two, when you go and verify, and that's it. That's how we move pretty fast. Mm-hmm. But yeah, never hesitate to reach out and like, hey, this was kind of odd, whatever. We're more than happy to look into it for you real fast. We're pretty quick on the draw there for sure. See, David, I set a min on all my ASINs, but they're selling at lower prices. How do I fix this? Because some of my sales are at a loss now. What is most likely happening? And again, I would urge you to reach out to support, because we can dive way deeper into your actual account, your actual data here. 9 times out of 10, when I see this, it has to come, or usually comes down to merchant fulfilled with shipping. So what ends up happening is Aura looks at and reprices against what's called the landed price. This is the combination between your price and what you are charging on shipping, right? That's the whole thing. So what can be confusing, if this is the case, is that your minimum, as an example, is $15, and you're charging $5 in shipping. Therefore, your price is $10. So as a user, you can say, well, $10 is less than 15. That's an issue. Feels that way. But because we look at the landed price, actually, we're right there at your minimum price. So we actually never went beneath that. The other examples that I tend to see here is that the min and maxes actually change themselves at the period of which you're looking at that price change. Meaning, if you go to the pricing activity, look at the logs there, and you see, okay, pull up the actual event, the pricing activity itself of where it looks to have gone beneath your min price. If you click on that and open up that modal, you'll actually see the exact min and max price at that time. So anytime we go to analyze events, pricing updates, what have you, we look at what was true at that snapshot, because things can change, right? Fees can change, all these things. And so a lot of times what ends up happening is we look at it, the actual min and max, or just the min, depending on how it's being calculated, actually adjusted itself because the fee itself changed. So while it looks now, because the fees could have reverted, it really just depends, could have been now not profitable at that point, was actually technically profitable. This is why it's always good to reach out to support, because we can dive deep and look exactly at the data and tell you exactly what's happening. I don't want you to have to guess. We'll tell you. We'll show you. So I would say that's probably, the vast majority is one of those two cases. But Casey, any other ideas that come to mind?
Yeah, one thought there is, David, if you're having Aura calculate your min and max prices based off of ROI, any MFN shipping fees, or really any shipping fees you incur on a listing, even if it's a shipping fee for shipping that to Amazon to then be FBA, you want to factor those into the cost field so that Aura can account for them. If they're not factored in there, then Aura could be miscalculating that min and max price based on ROI because those fees aren't factored in. So that can kind of slightly throw things off there, cause things to sell at a minimum price where Aura thinks maybe it's 20% ROI, when in reality it's more like 12 to 14, whatever that actual number may be. I did actually publish a help article on this today, repricing FBA versus MFN listings. So that's laid out in there. Pretty quick fix and pretty easy to digest. If it's not easy to digest, let us know. I just published that and I can make any tweaks there, but that might be the other thing there as well, David.
Nice. And another thing we recently launched as well was a roadmap, a feature, a place to go directly to get feedback or give us feedback, request features. So I just put it here on the page. You don't have to, the system just knows it's you. And what's nice is you can actually go and look at the feature request and you can see what's already there. You can upvote, which is kind of cool. If you're like, oh, cool, I want that too. Great, upvote it. Let us know how we can prioritize things for you guys. And then, of course, if there's something that you wanted or would be like, this would be amazing to have, great, throw it in there if it's not already there. And what's nice is as we start to work on these things, you get notified that we're working on it or that's shipped, all these things. And if we need to beta test something, we're probably going to reach out to the person who recommended it, right? So you most likely have a high probability of being pulled in the early days and being able to have kind of a voice and a say in how things work, depending on what they are. So I would highly recommend doing that if you haven't already. There's still, a decent amount in here already. Yeah, a lot of good stuff here. I'm pretty excited. There's a lot of fun stuff that I'm really excited about in terms of new features. All kinds of ideas are flowing right now. Looking at gamification is just the coolest thing. I know I haven't been in tech for a while. It feels kind of old school, but there's actually some deep research happening right now that's really exciting. One of the things I put a feature request myself in. I put it there. I'm very excited for it. Being able to share a strategy, right? Like, we have a lot of newer sellers coming to the space, and I would say the biggest friction, if you will, is, what's my first strategy? We have education content, all these things. Obviously, you can reach out to us. We're more than happy to help you one-on-one, create these things, answer any questions you have. But we're thinking, a lot of people come into us from word of mouth, right? People talking about us. And it'd be nice to be like, well, what do you use? What's your strategy? Here's a link. Just copy it over. That'd be kind of cool. It would definitely, I think, speed things up for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
See, another great question here, Prince. Does Maven know how many units a competitor has in stock and take this into account when repricing? It does not. I get this probably once every 3 days as a request. I really wish we could. So as a software company that really sits on top of Amazon's data and really Amazon's API, there's some pieces of information we are able to get access to and others they don't expose. Which this one, I really agree that they should not expose this because it's kind of a privacy thing. Having been a seller, if I knew that they were exposing my inventory quantities to my competition, I would be slightly upset. So I don't think they will ever do this. Now, that then leads to the question of, well, how do other software companies do this? Most of the time, those are Chrome extensions, right? So they're actually doing a little bit of hacking on the page itself whenever you load onto the page. From what I've seen, they're not very accurate. They used to be when the 999 trick worked, because that's basically just what they did. Even if you look at Keepa, right? If you look at Keepa's suggestion based on what they think they have, it's really off. That's not to say it's not usable. If it's very consistent in the way it's being calculated, I think that's somewhat better than not having anything. I would love to be able to get that information because I think 1000% it would make Maven better. Without a doubt. If I just know that when I'm competing against Casey and I have 500 units and Casey has 2, my behavior is probably going to change unless I know he's got 1,000, right? So that makes a lot of sense. But there's a lot of these things we're trying to look at to start to factor into Maven. But I wish is the answer. So. Awesome. And by the way, if you're not using Aura on your phone, you should. It's wonderful. We're very proud of it. I'm going to show you guys now. You add it essentially just like if you add it as a bookmark, but it performs just like a mobile app. And we have support down here and everything. And it's funny, I find, especially as I go to meetups and stuff, so many people are just like, yeah, I'll check that when I get on my computer. Why not? It's right here. You're good to go. You don't have to, especially if you're doing RA and you're on the road all the time. I've seen people on Twitter post pictures of them like they're on their laptop in their car. I'm like, yeah, you don't have to do that anymore. It's all good. We do have a help desk article. So if you go to help.goaura.com and search mobile, we'll walk you through exactly how to do that on either iPhone or on Android. It's actually really simple, really straightforward. It's fantastic. But keep those questions coming. This is awesome. I feel like we're diving into some good stuff here. You guys are keeping me from geeking out AI too hard, so I appreciate that. It's my go-to. Oh, man. Yeah, really good stuff here. And we have a lot of stuff on the roadmap, too. I think this is what's important. When we came out with 1.0, it was such a massive shift in terms of the changes, right? So much changed so overnight, seemingly. Mm-hmm. And people are like, this is great. I'm like, it's like 10% of what we want to do. It just that was the minimum we could justify having before we released the new system for speed. So super, super important. But yeah, there's so much here. Even seeing some of the feature requests and feedback coming in through our new feedback system. I'm just like, man, never thought about that. That makes so much sense. Maven related stuff too, certain Maven behaviors is kind of interesting as well. Definitely cool. Chad Pruitt, that's it, man. Share sheet, add a home screen on Safari, done. It's wonderful. It is actually very awesome. So one of the things I'm very happy with as a team is when we design new pages, new features, what have you, we first design on mobile because it has the biggest constraints. Things are different. There's no hover state on mobile, right? The functionality has to be slightly different. So what we do is we design for the biggest level of constraints first, and then we expand out to desktop because that just makes it much easier to do versus doing the inverse. So it just lets us be faster, right? We don't have to go in and say, okay, well, we built this for desktop, for browser. We now have to go redo all that work for mobile as well. No, it's just kind of baked in, just goes live. It's wonderful. Definitely nice for speed. See if it ends. I love this question. I've often wondered how two AI repricers would interact with their primary A and B setting competitive pricings or collaborating for increased profits. Casey, I want to get your thoughts on this first before I dive in.
Yeah, so if my understanding is correct, and especially with the way Maven operates, is since it is analyzing those competitors, it's going to either match or price under their behavior, essentially. So if Maven recognizes, hey, whatever I do with this price, this other person's going to match it, or this other AI model is going to match it, it's going to hold your price to not tank a listing, not continually drop the price to try and get it back, and then that other person matches you. All of a sudden, two people are at your mid price. Whereas if it recognizes that, hey, this person is just matching your price, it's going to stay. And then kind of vice versa, if it knows it's going to keep pricing under, then it will kind of mirror that behavior. So it does adjust depending on how that competition is reacting to your repricing. But I'm sure, Dylan, you have a either more in-depth or a better, more succinct way of describing that.
No, that's good. That's really good. It definitely hit the nail on the head. This question is usually asked in a vacuum, meaning if nothing else changes, the listing demand doesn't change. We're not looking at the difference between Q1, Q4, what have you, and we only have two sellers on that listing, both using Maven. Most likely what would happen is we would end up at the optimal price sharing that buy box together. Now, even in that vacuum, this is where you get into human behavior. I'm going to call it seller psychology. I just coined a new term. That's what we're going to go with, right? Seller psychology. We all know that when you first come in stock, you're very conservative with your prices, right? It's all about maximizing profitability. However, as time increases, you become more aggressive with your price because now there's an opportunity cost of that capital sitting there. You got long-term storage fees, all these things. So it's hard to hold all things equal because let's assume Casey and I are these two sellers in this example. If we both came in on the same day with the same quantity, we would most likely end up basically matching at the optimal price. Now, the optimal price itself could change. Like that could go down, that could go up. Really just depends here. Let's factor that out for a moment, just for simplicity. Most likely, we're not coming in with the same quantity at the same price. Keep that in mind too, right? Most people have different costs and at the same quantity in total. And so in a vacuum, theoretically, it's pretty straightforward. In reality, it's way more chaotic than that. The moment you throw a third seller in here, all of a sudden, it's reality. It just depends. I love when people are like, how does Maven work? I'm like, that's a loaded question, because there's so many scenarios and variables at play. That's what's fun, right? Is like Maven is designed and optimized to handle this massive level of complexities that change in real time that humans we just couldn't do. A basic algorithm just couldn't do that, couldn't handle that. And Maven will also intentionally forget what it knows about your competition because of what I mentioned about that longevity, right? That life cycle of a seller coming in being very conservative at the forefront and then becoming more aggressive over time. So just because Casey and I are matching this week doesn't mean we're going to match next week. He might become more aggressive, be like, I just want to move it. Fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But now the entire environment itself has changed. Therefore, so does our behavior. So it gets really into the weeds, but I do love this. I remember when we first launched Aura, people were like, well, what if every seller on that listing is using Aura? I don't know. Depends, right? Like, are you aggressive, non-aggressive? It really, even with rule based, is like it's so hard to know because there's so many things that are contextual or specific to each seller, that it's just hard to say. If you give me the actual raw data, I can tell you exactly what's going to happen, but that's very very specific, which is fun. See, Chad, I love this. Chad is vying for a specific upvote. I agree. I think this is a great one, by the way. Being able to rearrange listing columns. So with 1.0, we introduced a lot of amazing updates and upgrades to the listings view, that table view, right? Allowing you to decide which columns you show, which ones you want to hide. Some things you care about, some things you don't. Awesome. Adding better filtering. But one thing we do want to do here is actually allow you to basically decide in what order you want to see this information. When we sat down with probably a little over 100 users just before we even wrote code, just the design, and we're like, what do you care about? What makes sense here? And what's funny is every seller is so different in terms of what they prioritize and what they care for. And so that led us to believe, okay, well, it needs to be customizable, right? It doesn't need to be on us to tell you what's important. You decide what's important. We enable you to basically prioritize yourself. So that's definitely coming. That is currently, I believe, number 1 on the feature requests list. So Chad, I think you're in a good position there. Seems pretty high. But if anybody would like to further upvote, go for it. There's a lot there. So definitely exciting stuff. Chad, another question here. What are your thoughts on the yo-yo features found in other repricers like SellerSnap? Would you say Maven achieves this price increases without a strict yo-yo rule? It's a good question. We tend to call the yo-yo strategy a oscillation strategy because oscillation goes up and down. It's just a wave. What's interesting is you can really achieve the oscillation strategy with a rule-based strategy. It doesn't require that much complexity. What's interesting, though, is because I've been thinking a lot about this, actually, this very specific question. The way a yo-yo is typically done is very simplistic, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It's not factoring in that many things. Where is it going to? That matters. Is it just going up? Okay, well, relative to what, right? Is it just going up relative to your current price? Is it going up relative to your max price? That creates a lot of problems, right? And so when does it do that? I think is also important. And so I think the yo-yo strategy is very good for a rule-based world. However, when you get to like real AI-based repricing, you have to understand that we're optimizing for a specific outcome. That specific outcome with Maven, the version 1 here that we have, is the balance between profitability and sales velocity. We call this natural price optimal price. This is the optimal price you should be at, where we're maximizing profitability, but we're not losing sales velocity, right? There's always this balance. Welcome to economics. And so when do you raise your price versus when do you lower your price? This matters. And it matters based on your competition. If I know Casey's always going to match me no matter what I do, whether I go up or down, why do I ever want to go down? Maybe I do. I don't know, right? But this is where you get, again, to the level of complexity for each individual listing. And so I think when you don't contextualize your behavior to each individual competitor that you're actively competing with, I think you're missing out. And this is what I was talking about at the beginning of the conversation, which is I think really we've been at like 40 to 60% of what repricing tools are capable of. And we're trying to get closer to 80, 90%. I think that leap is massive. I think Maven gets us probably just the current version, probably closer to like 10 to 15% above, but there's still a lot of room to grow there, right? There's still a lot of complexities to begin factoring in, to begin understanding. There's still some behaviors that we're theoretically thinking about, just kind of like on paper, that we need to go and test and experiment with that may or may not work, right? Like age of inventory as a factor is a good one. Love the idea. I don't know because I don't have the data. It's hard for me to say, yeah, that makes sense. Rationally, sure. But, as we've all learned, Amazon is not always very rational, and neither are people, right? I was a finance major, and a lot of when you get into like behavioral finance, really traditional finance it just assumes everyone's rational. They're not because they're humans. And that's why you had this breakout of this whole other subject matter called behavioral finance, where it looks at it and says, what's the actual data? What do people actually do? because turns out they're not very efficient and they're not very rational. Therefore, that changes how you have to model certain things. So I think, again, just to kind of sum up here, the yo-yo makes a ton of sense at a very, if you just have access to rule base and that's all you're doing, I think that's fantastic. But I think Maven takes that multiple steps forward in terms of how it's being done, the behaviors themselves, when it's being done, all these different things. It's a whole different, honestly, I think Maven requires you to think slightly different about repricing as a concept. And I think that's something we need to talk more about. But Casey, any follow-ups with you on that?
No follow-ups there. I mean, I think the oscillation strategy can help kind of get you back in the game on some listings. If, a current buy box price or a price is lower than your set min, by going back up to that max, if they're using a repricer, they might recognize that gap, come back within your range, and you can kind of duke it back out again. That's probably the most likely outcome. The other outcome is they sell out at the lower price, and then you might be the owner of the listing, and then you reprice to the buy box or whatever's optimal there. But yeah, I typically recommend the rules-based approach there to achieve the yo-yo, as Maven won't necessarily recognize that that's maybe the best strategy at any given point.
Yeah, exactly. And so, Lewis, this is actually a great follow-up to what we're talking about, here, which is like, is Maven factoring in my current quantity, storage fees, all these things? And that's kind of what I was talking about with that age of inventory, really. Right now, it doesn't. This is what's so fun about what we built, right? Let's talk about this for a moment. There's a big difference between us giving you a bunch of strategies that we call AI that we can't update because there's no model, right? It's not. It's so frustrating, because how do you update a settings-based strategy? Well, I either remove a setting, give you a setting, or change what a setting means. That's kind of the only possibilities here. Whereas Maven is a model. And I always refer to it as a model, not a strategy, because again, they're very different. And I think that's important because it helps you kind of separate those and label them a little bit better. The underlying model of Maven itself can change. And so what's interesting is, let's assume for a moment that age of inventory, we factored it in, we solved it, and like it works really, really well. And we're just like, awesome, right? We beta tested it, alpha tested it, and just like, for sure, it increases performance. Well, when we roll that change out to everyone using Maven, you don't have to do anything. You just got better performance. It's kind of like if you have a Tesla, right? There's been some mainstream news lately that Tesla recalled 240,000 cars. Mine was one of those. You know what's funny? It wasn't a recall. It was a software update that I clicked on my phone and said, yeah, go do it. It was like, cool, give me 30 minutes. And then like, nothing was even broken. It was just a small update. But think about that, right? It's like, you don't have to go change the vehicle, change all these things. Instead, what you get is to change the foundation of what it is. But you as the user, this is what's so important. You as the user, you don't have to go do any of it. You just got better performance, and you woke up to an email that said, hey, we're getting away from version 1. It's version 1.5, version 2 even, I don't know yet. Here's all the changes, here's all the updates, and like, just enjoy the better performance. Do nothing else. You're good. That's just a fundamentally different thing, right? And I think that's what really helps us, stand out from our competition, especially with Maven. That concept right there, I think, is a massive differentiator versus, hey, we just gave you 5-10 more strategies. Like, great, now I have to go deeply understand those. I still have to set them up, hopefully correctly, versus just give me an email and tell me you made me better. That sounds wonderful. Like, to me, I'm a big Iron Man fan, right? The Jarvis, like, I want you to wake up and basically feel like Jarvis was just like, yeah, I just made this better for you. You good? Yeah. All right. Bye. So nice. Marquis, yeah, made my yo-yo effect the other day. Thanks to support. Shout out to support. Casey, Finn, these guys. And got $20 above the buy box just now. Love that. Love hearing that. And so what's nice is, like, I'm not sure if you guys did this with Maven or if you did this with role base. You could definitely do a simplistic version with role base all day long. I have very consistently seen, not that I'm setting any expectations, but I've consistently seen comments on socials basically stating this, like, hey, I'm getting sales 10, 15, $20 above the buy box right now with competition. Again, this highlights the effect. Assuming we're talking about Maven here, I wouldn't call it a yo-yo strategy because, again, it's Maven, totally different. But Maven can strategically do this, and that's what's so incredible. It's great. It's really, really cool. Do you remember, Casey, was this you?
I believe that was me working with Marquis there. Yeah, I think
Yes.
we were able to walk through that with a few screenshots, get him set up. So yeah, glad to see it's working there.
Nice. See, that's what's fun, right? This is when people are like, why is Aura different than anybody else? I don't even start with the product. I start with our team. Like, listen, like, for sure, you have access to our team. When you work with us, you don't just get access to the software and the code, you get access to the team. It's right now I'm working on a blog post of basically how to network as a seller. And a lot of what I talk about is that is a superpower, because when you know somebody who can solve or who has already solved your most complex problem, and you built a relationship and you're just like, hey, can you help me solve it? You just took 3 months of your life and a lot of pitfalls down to an email, text, a phone call. And like, now it's just solved. And so we built our customer support, customer success infrastructure to enable us to do this at scale, which is like, I don't need you to be an expert in repricing. We already got that down. We've been doing it for a while. Just reach out to us. We love educating. That's why we're doing these kind of things. And very soon we're going to get back to doing like weekly deep dive webinars, like just literally teaching this one aspect, whether that's workflows, productivity. There's some stuff I really want to geek out with our users on, using tools like Raycast and all these other fun stuff that Casey knows I geek out with. But yeah, it's really fun. Our team's very supportive. When Casey came on board, I'm like, we're very consultative in the way we approach this. It's not just Q&A. It's not just, I have a question, give me an answer, give me an article. I fundamentally don't get what the heck's happening. We go, great. Let's take that down, get to the root of it, build it back up, and we got you. We do that relatively fast. So super, super important. Chad, I appreciate this. I've used a lot of repricers, and your support is without a doubt unmatched. I fundamentally agree. When we first set out to build the company, again, James and I have been sellers. We have used all these other tools, and we very much agree. When we sat down, we're like, what are our pillars? How are we different? Before even writing code, it's like, well, amazing product. That's what we knew we wanted. And amazing support. It turns out it's not that difficult to do. I think we pulled it off. But again, even there, I think I told you this, Casey, when you first came on board, like, we're really well known for this, but I think we're about 60 to 70% of what we're capable of. So we still need to ratchet it up in terms of quality and all these good things. Still, again, a lot of room for improvement across the board.
Definitely.
Let's see here. Nice. Vadim, you're right. I've experienced occasional unexpected sales at significantly high prices out of the blue. I suspect this occurs because Maven acts swiftly in repricing, causing a delay in Amazon's API, updating the buy box position. Sometimes customers might get stuck with a high price for a product. It's quite intriguing. Not exactly how we're utilizing it. Maven's very precise in how it updates its price. That's what I'll say. However, Hyperdrive, if you have not used it, you should. Hyperdrive is wonderful. With the recent pricing changes, we made Maven and Hyperdrive available to literally everyone. No matter what tier you're on, you have access to these in some way, shape, or form. In the blog post we released this past Tuesday dives deep into really defining what instant repricing really means. Welcome to marketing. So instant repricing means that in our system that we control, we're not slowing you down, right? So if your repricing tool is saying, we're going to reprice you once every 15 minutes, you're being penalized for paying less in a discussion. Like, that's a choice. However, instant repricing really means, based on the feed system that everybody uses, to submit price changes. Once we submit it, it's going to take 1.5 to 2 minutes to go round trip, meaning we submitted it and Amazon came back and said, I accept it. It's confirmed. It's live. You're good. So really, instant repricing means 1.5 to 2 minutes flat. However, with Hyperdrive, we found a way with this new release to do that round trip now, not in 1.5 to 2 minutes, but in less than 10 seconds, up to 50 SKUs. That's kind of the upper limit there, which is fundamentally a game changer, especially for things that are very high in competition, right? I always go to toys in Q4. Just tons of competition. Speed matters, right? If you could reprice 12 times in the same time your competition can reprice once, that is a fundamentally objective, better thing. Now layer Maven on top of that in parallel. So now we not only have speed, we have precision and complexity handled. This changes everything. So whereas you can apply Maven to more SKUs than you can Hyperdrive, really think through what SKUs need Hyperdrive, which ones just have a large number of competition that would really benefit from it. We tend to just organically see more buy box ownership percentage, which kind of makes sense when you think about it rationally. But it's fantastic. Hyperdrive is, when we stumbled on it, we're like, there's no way this is real. It was stable, it was wonderful, it was confirmed, and we're like, okay. I think Maven was going to be, the number one massive change, but Hyperdrive is right up there with it, in my opinion. It's fantastic.
Yeah, that was going through my interview process before I officially joined the team. I was trying to compare and contrast, obviously, us against other folks in the market. And it was with having no real in-depth knowledge of the space. Hyperdrive was very clearly like speed is the most important thing. And now, like you said, layering Maven on top gets you the ability to be precise, have that in-depth knowledge that you might not have otherwise. So yeah, definitely extremely powerful to leverage them together on the same listings.
Yeah, exactly. Chad, a little follow up here. Can you speak to the sales velocity increase you guys have seen in testing Hyperdrive? I can't speak to the sales velocity itself, and I'll explain why. It allows you, from what I've seen, to get into the buy box more often, just because we're repricing faster and more times, right? More frequently. Sales velocity is a slightly different thing that you don't really control, right? Think about it this way. If I have two listings, let's say you're in the buy box 100% of the time on both, but the demand in listing A versus listing B is fundamentally different. Your sales velocity is also fundamentally different. And so it's less about sales velocity. That's not really what it solves. It really solves for being well-positioned at as real time as possible. And in doing so, we tend to just organically see you be in the buy box. So it's kind of like, I like to tell people repricing doesn't create sales, right? We don't create customers. What we do is we position you for the sales that are already occurring. We're basically saying, hey, there's a buyer in front of you, and there's a line of people trying to sell to that buyer. Well, if you're at the front, you're getting the sale, right? Hyperdrive lets you basically skip the line and go to the front and be like, you can buy mine. And there we go. Now, if there are no buyers at the moment and you're at the front of the line, you're still well positioned, but there's still no buyers, right? And this is why I keep thinking about this concept of like, well, is there a world where we could essentially go in using AI and really optimize every listing you're on to increase conversion rate for sales on that listing, to increase how high it's ranking for certain keywords, maybe even choosing better fit keywords that are higher trafficked. You kind of have the supply and demand side of things, right? We can't really control the demand side. We really try to manipulate the supply side. But what if we could well position the demand side? At least we can't control it, but could we do things on the front end, so to speak, to make sure that we're capturing more of the market of buyers for that type of thing? That gets kind of interesting. So that's something like kind of playing around with as a concept, at least as a thought experiment, if you will. Yeah. Sums it up perfectly. There's a lot of variables. And even Maven, Maven handles a lot, to be honest. And even there, I think there's a ton of opportunity of us factoring in other things too, for sure. Yeah. I'm curious, like Casey, for you in an ideal world, what is Maven? What is it factoring in? How do you view it?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a combination of things. I mean, I think it's going to be the buy box ownership, as we've talked about. 5 out of every 6 sales are coming from buy box. So ideally, it's a combination of that with the new I forget the official name of the fee, having inventory on shelves for too long. Yep, that is another thing. So having that sales velocity in there. while also not killing the margin. Those are the three
Mhm.
primary things that immediately come to mind. Obviously there's going to be other things that kind of come in and out, the ability to beat out folks that maybe have more optimal shipping, but Amazon weighs that in their buy
Mhm.
box determination. Those are really kind of the big three that I think of: buy box, ownership, and then
Yeah.
sales velocity and margin. Obviously you don't want to hit those fees for having inventory in stock for too long or having too much of it,
Mhm.
but you don't want to sell it all at your min price or at 0% return on investment. So those are really the main factors that I would hope it takes into account, and I know that it does
Yeah.
take those into account right now.
Yeah. I think for me, it's handling the full life cycle of a product, right? Um, when you look at how people create rule-based strategies, they do it in one of two ways. Either the life cycle, meaning days, if my inventory is less than 30 days, I do this. But then as it ages, I do this other thing. But then you have horizontal, meaning we're not looking at the life cycle, how long it's been there. We're really looking at exceptional scenarios. So V1 of Maven really handles a lot of those exceptional scenarios really well, like just out of the box. The life cycle gets kind of interesting, and this is why I keep coming back to the age of inventory as a good example here, because that tends to be the event, if you will, the variable that most people look at for making changes. So I think that's going to be the next biggest impact. But I think there's also I think we can't control certain things, right? A lot of people talk about regional buy boxes. It's not really a concept in the API. This is not something we can reprice against. It's just not even a concept. However, from a lot of what I've seen a lot of people experiment with this. Increasing your inventory, therefore having more spread, geographical spread, naturally increases your potential for getting access to the regional buy boxes, which naturally increases sales. So I do wonder if there's a world where we could create a model that could essentially predict the increase in sales based on your inventory levels. Could we say, hey, forecasting is a great. Let's talk forecasting for a brief moment here before we start to wrap up. I think forecasting is an area that really needs a lot of improvement. There's just everybody I've talked to that has either attempted to do it or has done it. It's just like you can't do it. I think I disagree. Granted, I haven't directly worked on the problem yet, but I think we've attempted to use older algorithms, whereas there's a lot of new tech that makes this really, really fundamentally different. So I think it's possible we could actually fix this problem. But it's not just looking at, based on your sales velocity in two other variables, how much you should restock. I think it's, again, going towards complexity and saying, well, yeah, on base, you should probably order another 100 units by Tuesday so you don't run out of stock and you have, I don't know, 20 days worth of inventory at all times. However, what if you did increase that by 20% and we knew that it was 20% based on our data modeling that we know, or we can predict, should I say, you can increase sales by that amount simply by increasing inventory, not even repricing, just simply by having more inventory, more geographically spread, you could get more sales and own more of the market. I think there's potentially something there to explore and experiment with. No idea. Again, data is in reality is what matters here. But these are the kind of things that is kind of fun to use as a thought experiment and go explore, because it's hard to say. But I think there's a world there too that Maven is not just operating with your price in the competition. It's also way more forward looking and making recommendations on actions that only you can take. We can't do that. We can't buy your inventory for you, but you can. And maybe we can enable you to make better buying decisions based on the data we have. That gets kind of interesting too.
Yeah, I think inventory management is going to be the biggest thing for this year. If there's one area to really double down and focus on and fine tune your strategies, especially with those fees coming in a few months, that's where I think there's going to be a lot of waves this upcoming year.
Yeah, Vadim. Yeah, do you believe it's possible to incorporate Maven in a way that utilizes sales analytics to provide an estimate, restock quantity based on various factors influencing sales at any given moment? I do believe there's a possibility here. I think analytics, I think inventory management, these are things that in the past held little weight on what we do as a repricing company, but that's starting to change, I think, quite a bit. So there's a lot more overlap here. And Chad, yeah, everyone is going to start thinking about forecasting more these new low inventory fees they're adding in April. Yeah, I mean, listen, here's the thing, right? Like fees change every year. And that means that the game itself begins to change. And I think I've said this plenty of times. I'll say it again here. You are drowning in wonderful, beautiful, impactful data, and it is just not insightful or impactful for you. It's just not presented in a actionable, insightful way. And I think helping you make better decisions based on real data could be massive. I think, there's a big difference between forecasting with wholesale private label than there are, resellers who may never restock. This is where it gets complicated, right? There's a big difference between those two things. And so I think being able to solve that problem is very complex, but very impactful if solved correctly. So nice. Cool. Casey, as we wrap up here, any highlights, any things you want to end on?
No real highlights. I think it was a great discussion. Thanks, folks, for coming in with those different chat questions and concepts and kind of conversational pieces there. And thanks to everyone who thinks we do a great job in support. I appreciate that. And always we are there to help as things come up. And if you need any strategy advice or best practices stuff as well, we're there for that too.
Yeah. And Chad, I'm happy to say you received an additional 2 upvotes on the rearranging listing columns. So happy we could get you bumped up there. You're for sure in the running on that one. But yeah, so again, we're doing these every week, every Wednesday, 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. EST. Don't feel like you have to wait to ask us a question for these. Reach out to support. We want to help you solve problems fast, get answers, get educated faster. But would love for this to become a really awesome thing over time where we can just sit down, have these deeper discussions, and even just have an opportunity for you as a user, as a seller to jump in and be like, I have this idealized fantasy world. Can we talk about it? Yes. Because a lot of times there's a nugget in there that is actually possible that we could do. And that gets really exciting for us. We like this cutting edge kind of theoretical stuff. So yeah, awesome. So with that, we will leave you guys to it. Enjoy the rest of your week. Happy New Year. 2024 again, very exciting. And we will see you guys next week. Have a good one.